4 o'clock in the morning, I don't think many of them are playing.
The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, wasn't just another talk show flickering on late-night screens. It was a stage where legends were tested, reputations were born, and laughter became a kind of immortality. Carson himself wasn't only a host. He was the quiet gatekeeper of American comedy. His raised eyebrow, a suppressed grin, or a sudden burst of laughter could change the course of a comedian's career overnight. For more than 30 years, if you could make Johnny Carson laugh, you weren't just funny. You were destined to be remembered. Night after night, Carson's desk became a throne, and his audience a tribunal. Comics walked onto that stage knowing the stakes: succeed, and you might be invited to sit on the couch. A gesture that meant you'd earned Johnny's seal of approval. Fail, and you would vanish into the endless line of hopefuls who never got a second chance. But for a select few, The Tonight Show became more than a gig. It became the crucible in which they forged comedy that defined entire generations. There were the fearless truth-tellers like George Carlin, who dared to question politics, religion, and the absurd rules of everyday life. There were the raw confessions of Richard Pryor, who spun his pain into laughter so powerful it shook audiences to their core. And then came the hurricane of Robin Williams, exploding onto Carson's stage with speed and chaos that somehow became pure art. Others, too, etched themselves into late-night history. Rodney Dangerfield with his relentless one-liners and no-respect persona. Joan Rivers, whose biting wit made her both trailblazer and lightning rod. Buddy Hackett, the warm storyteller who felt like family. Don Rickles, the insult comic so sharp he could roast Carson to his face. And Jonathan Winters, whose improvisations turned everyday objects into entire worlds of comedy. The list stretches further. Bob Newhart with his slow, deliberate timing. Tim Conway with his infectious, corpsing laughter. Steven Wright with deadpan riddles from another planet. And a young Jim Carrey, whose rubber face and spot-on impressions left Carson grinning like few others could. These weren't just appearances. They were cultural events. Unforgettable encounters that still ripple through the comedy world decades later. And tonight, we revisit them, not just as routines, but as the moments that proved Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was the true kingdom of comedy. So let's step back in time. Let's relive the sharp satire of Carlin, the raw honesty of Pryor, the whirlwind of Williams, the fearless bite of Rivers, and the many others who turned laughter into legacy. This is the story of Johnny Carson's funniest and most unforgettable comedians. Character number 1, George Carlin. George Carlin didn't just step onto Johnny Carson's stage. He charged into it with the kind of fearlessness that made audiences sit up straighter in their chairs. Where others played it safe with airline food and awkward dating jokes, Carlin went straight for the jugular of American culture. He spoke about politics, religion, and the silent hypocrisies woven into daily life. It was dangerous territory for television. But on Carson's Tonight Show, it became unforgettable. Carlin had a razor-sharp rhythm. His delivery was fast, biting, and relentless, like a machine gun that never missed its mark. Every line carried the weight of truth wrapped in humor. You laughed, but you also squirmed, because he was exposing something real, something people weren't used to hearing on national television. That was Carlin's genius. He wasn't just telling jokes, he was dismantling illusions. Yet Carlin wasn't reckless. He had a remarkable ability to read the room, to sense how far he could push without snapping the thread completely. He could take a taboo subject, strip it down, and reveal its absurdity, all while keeping the audience roaring. That delicate balance is what made Carson respect him so deeply. Johnny admired comics who could combine intelligence with timing, and Carlin was the epitome of both. When Carson smirked or chuckled during one of Carlin's sets, the moment felt electric. It wasn't just late-night comedy, it was cultural commentary disguised as stand-up. Millions of viewers saw not just a man making jokes, but a performer pulling back the curtain on American life itself. Every time Carlin took the stage, it felt less like entertainment and more like an event. Something people would talk about the next morning at work or remember decades later. Carlin's Tonight Show appearances cemented him as more than a comedian. He was a provocateur, a philosopher with a microphone, and a truth-teller in a world that often preferred polite silence. His fearlessness on Carson's stage wasn't just about pushing boundaries, it was about redrawing them entirely. For many, those nights watching George Carlin with Johnny Carson weren't just about laughter. They were moments when television stopped being a distraction and became a mirror. And in that mirror, America saw both its flaws and its absurdities, reflected back with a smirk and a punchline. Character number 2, Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor didn't just perform comedy. He opened himself up like a wound on stage. When he walked onto Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, audiences never knew if they were about to laugh until their sides hurt, or sit in stunned silence as he revealed something raw and personal. Pryor blurred the line between humor and confession, and that's what made him so magnetic. His routines weren't polished monologues filled with tidy punchlines. They were jagged, unfiltered glimpses into his own battles, with poverty, addiction, relationships, and race in America. Yet somehow, Pryor spun these struggles into laughter. He had a gift for exposing the pain of his own life and transforming it into comedy that felt both cathartic and communal. People weren't just laughing at Pryor. They were laughing with him, sharing the relief of survival through humor. On Carson's stage, this style was revolutionary. Pryor could ignite the room with wild, unpredictable energy, then pivot suddenly into moments of almost heartbreaking honesty. 1 second, he'd have the crowd bent over in laughter with a perfectly timed impression or a joke about everyday absurdities. The next, he'd speak with such brutal honesty that you could feel the air shift. That unpredictability made his Tonight Show appearances feel less like performances and more like experiences, something the audience lived through together. Johnny Carson, a man who admired discipline and craftsmanship in comedy, had enormous respect for Pryor. He knew Pryor was different, raw, risky, sometimes chaotic, but always authentic. Carson didn't try to contain him. Instead, he gave Pryor space to be himself, understanding that his brilliance came from his unpredictability. And when Carson laughed at a Pryor routine, it felt like validation not just of the jokes, but of the man himself. Those appearances remain electric even decades later. You can watch Pryor's clips today and still feel the pulse of danger, the spark of a performer who refused to hide behind a mask. He wasn't a comedian who told jokes. He was a storyteller, a confessor, a survivor who dragged his scars into the spotlight and somehow made them funny. For the Tonight Show audience, Richard Pryor was unforgettable because he reminded them that comedy wasn't always clean or safe. Sometimes it was jagged, messy, and painfully real. And in that truth, Pryor found the kind of connection that most comedians only dream about. Character number 3, Robin Williams. If Richard Pryor was raw honesty, Robin Williams was pure chaos wrapped in genius. The moment he bounded onto Johnny Carson's stage, it felt as if a storm had swept into the studio. Williams didn't walk. He exploded, racing through voices, characters, and improvised tangents at a speed no one else could match. He was a human hurricane, unpredictable and unstoppable. Carson, a master of control and timing, recognized that Robin wasn't someone you tried to rein in. He knew the best thing to do was simply sit back, smile, and let the whirlwind unfold. And unfold it did. Williams ricocheted from Shakespearean monologues to cartoon voices, from surreal observations to deeply personal jokes, sometimes within the same 30 seconds. The audience was breathless, not just from laughing, but from trying to keep up. What made Williams extraordinary wasn't only his velocity. Beneath the chaos was a sharp, quicksilver mind that stitched everything together. His improvisations weren't random. They were clever, layered, and deeply connected to the world around him. Watching him was like watching a magician pull endless scarves out of a hat, except each scarf turned into a new character, a new world, a new punchline. The Tonight Show became a perfect playground for him. Unlike the rigid structure of many television spots, Carson's stage offered Robin the freedom to let loose. He could make the camera crew double over, send Carson into fits of laughter, and still somehow deliver a routine that felt both spontaneous and polished. That blend of chaos and craft was uniquely his. Audiences adored him because he made unpredictability feel safe, even joyful. You never knew where Robin would go next, but you wanted to follow. And Carson's reactions, sometimes stunned, sometimes roaring with laughter, were part of the magic. The image of Johnny with his hand over his mouth, watching Robin whirl across the stage, is etched into Tonight Show history. Williams's appearances weren't just comedy, they were experiences, moments where the line between performer and performance dissolved. He embodied what it meant to be alive in the moment, and that energy crackled through every laugh. Decades later, his visits to Carson's stage remain some of the most re-watched clips, proof that lightning can strike more than once if the bottle is strong enough to hold it. Character number 4, Rodney Dangerfield. If Robin Williams was a hurricane of chaos, Rodney Dangerfield was the king of precision. He didn't need speed or wild characters. He needed only a microphone, a nervous tug at his tie, and an endless stream of one-liners. When Rodney walked onto Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, the audience knew they were in for a rhythm so relentless it left them gasping for air between laughs. His persona was as iconic as his jokes, the perpetually disrespected man. "I don't get no respect," he'd groan, and then unleash a barrage of punchlines that turned self-deprecation into an art form. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. Bulging eyes, a sweaty forehead, his voice cracking under the weight of mock despair. Each line landed like a drumbeat, quick and merciless. Carson loved him because he was a craftsman. Rodney's timing was airtight, his delivery flawless, and his character so convincing that you couldn't tell where the real man ended and the bit began. That was his magic. He embodied his act so fully that audiences believed it, even as they laughed at its absurdity. Unlike comics who built long stories or improvised on the spot, Dangerfield operated like a joke machine. The moment one laugh faded, another joke slammed in. Carson often leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief as Rodney rattled off line after line without missing a beat. And when Johnny laughed, it wasn't just polite. It was genuine admiration for a performer who had mastered his craft. Rodney's Tonight Show appearances became legendary precisely because they were so dependable. You knew he would kill every time, yet the audience never tired of him. His act was proof that simplicity, when executed with brilliance, could be just as powerful as chaos or improvisation. The irony, of course, is that Rodney Dangerfield claimed he got no respect, but The Tonight Show proved otherwise. Carson respected him, comedians respected him, and audiences adored him. His visits were more than performances. They were masterclasses in timing, proof that stand-up could be both efficient and devastatingly funny. Decades later, Rodney's no-respect persona remains one of the most enduring in comedy, and nowhere did it shine brighter than on Johnny Carson's stage, where the man who claimed to have none proved he had more than almost anyone. Character number 5, Joan Rivers. Among all the comedians who graced Johnny Carson's stage, Joan Rivers holds a story unlike any other. She wasn't just another guest delivering jokes. She was the woman Carson himself predicted would be a star. When she first appeared in 1965, Carson turned to her and said, "You're going to be a big hit." That single line became prophecy, because Rivers didn't just make people laugh. She broke barriers. In a comedy world dominated by men, Joan was fearless. Her humor was sharp, biting, and unapologetic, often cutting straight through the politeness expected of women at the time. She wasn't afraid to poke fun at celebrities, politics, or even her own flaws. What made her stand out was her honesty, her willingness to say out loud what others only whispered. That honesty could sting, but it also made her unforgettable. On The Tonight Show, her chemistry with Carson was undeniable. He respected her intelligence, her courage, and her timing. Audiences could feel the spark between them, a mutual admiration that turned every appearance into must-see television. Eventually, she became Carson's permanent guest host, the only woman to hold that position at the time. That wasn't just a promotion, it was a declaration that she had earned her place in late-night royalty. But beyond the history-making moments, Rivers was simply hilarious. She delivered her jokes with a rapid-fire style, her raspy voice carrying both wit and attitude. Her punchlines landed like little daggers, leaving the audience roaring even as they winced at her audacity. To watch Joan Rivers on Carson's stage was to see a performer who refused to play it safe, who dared to be as bold as any of her male counterparts, and often sharper. Carson valued courage in comedians, and Joan Rivers embodied it. She proved that women could be just as edgy, just as fearless, and just as funny in the high-pressure world of late-night comedy. Her appearances weren't only about laughter. They were about shifting the landscape, making space for voices that had long been pushed aside. Decades later, Rivers' Tonight Show moments remain milestones in television history. They are reminders that comedy isn't only about jokes. It's about daring to speak, daring to push boundaries, and daring to claim a spotlight that had been denied. On Johnny Carson's stage, Joan Rivers didn't just earn laughs. She earned a legacy. Character number 6, Buddy Hackett. If Joan Rivers brought sharp wit and fearless honesty, Buddy Hackett brought warmth, goofiness, and the comfort of a born storyteller. When he sat down on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, it felt less like a performance and more like a family gathering where your funniest uncle had the floor. His squinty eyes, rubbery expressions, and playful delivery turned even the simplest story into a riot. Hackett's humor was rooted in vaudeville, in the old traditions of comedy where timing and character mattered as much as the punchline. But on Carson's stage, that old-school style felt fresh, because Hackett infused it with his own personality. He didn't just tell jokes, he inhabited them, acting out scenes, exaggerating voices, and pulling faces until the entire studio was doubled over in laughter. Carson enjoyed Hackett because he brought something genuine. There was no slick veneer, no carefully polished act. Instead, Buddy gave the audience himself, awkward, silly, sometimes a little risque, but always heartfelt. He could weave a story about a neighbor, a vacation, or a misunderstanding with the police. And by the end, the audience felt like they had lived it with him. One of Hackett's greatest strengths was his range. He could start with a clean, family-friendly bit and, with a sly grin, slide into material that pushed boundaries. The transition was seamless, and Carson, always a careful observer, loved how Buddy could walk that line without alienating his audience. More than once, Johnny could be seen wiping away tears of laughter, caught up in the charm of Hackett's delivery. What set Buddy Hackett apart wasn't just his humor, but his heart. His performances felt warm, as though he was inviting everyone into his world for a few minutes of joy. Audiences adored him because he reminded them that comedy didn't always need to be sharp or satirical. Sometimes it could simply be about finding the ridiculous in everyday life and sharing it with a smile. Decades later, his Tonight Show appearances remain treasured clips, not just for the laughs, but for the reminder of how powerful genuine warmth can be in comedy. Buddy Hackett didn't try to outwit or outshock anyone. He simply made people laugh by being himself, and on Johnny Carson's stage, that was more than enough to make him unforgettable. Character number 7, Don Rickles. If Buddy Hackett felt like the hilarious uncle, Don Rickles was the sharp-tongued troublemaker you couldn't help but love. He didn't just tell jokes, he attacked. His weapon was insult comedy, and no one was safe. Celebrities, audience members, even Johnny Carson himself. When Rickles walked onto the Tonight Show stage, you knew sparks would fly. Rickles had a lightning-fast wit. He could size up a person in seconds and deliver a barb so sharp that it cut through the room and left everyone howling. Most comedians avoided mocking the host, but Rickles made a career out of it. He roasted Carson to his face, and Johnny let him get away with it because the results were pure comedy gold. Their chemistry was unique. Carson's calm, straight-faced demeanor against Rickles's fiery, relentless jabs created television that still feels dangerous decades later. One of the most legendary moments in Tonight Show history came when Rickles, guest hosting, accidentally broke Carson's cherished cigarette box. When Johnny returned and discovered the damage, he stormed onto the set mid-show, mock-furious, confronting Rickles in front of the cameras. The chaos that followed became one of the most replayed clips in late-night history. It was unscripted, it was outrageous, and it was hilarious. Exactly the kind of unpredictability that made Rickles so beloved. But behind the insults, Rickles was more than just a comic with a sharp tongue. He had impeccable timing, a sense of when to push and when to pull back. Audiences trusted him because his barbs, though brutal, were delivered with a wink. You laughed not because he tore someone down, but because he made everyone, including himself, part of the joke. Carson valued that. He understood that Rickles' style wasn't about cruelty. It was about honesty wrapped in humor. He let Rickles run wild on his stage because he knew it created moments viewers would never forget. And indeed, Rickles' appearances were always unpredictable, always risky, and always unforgettable. Today, Rickles is remembered as one of the greatest insult comics of all time, and much of that legacy was cemented on Johnny Carson's stage, in an era when television often played it safe. Don Rickles brought danger, and Carson, to his credit, knew that danger was exactly what made The Tonight Show thrilling. Character number 8, Jonathan Winters. Jonathan Winters didn't need a script to be funny. In fact, he was at his best when he had nothing at all. On Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, Winters embodied pure improvisation, turning chairs, hats, or even a glass of water into entire worlds of comedy. He wasn't just a comedian. He was a one-man theater, creating characters on the spot that audiences instantly believed. From the moment he sat down, you could feel the air in the studio shift. Winters would pick up an object, tilt his head, and suddenly he was someone else entirely. A grumpy grandfather, a nervous soldier, or a bewildered farmer. His ability to invent on the fly seemed almost supernatural. The jokes weren't written in advance. They were born right there, before your eyes. And that made them electric. Carson adored him for it. Unlike many hosts who might have tried to steer the chaos, Johnny let Winters roam free. He would lean back, laughing, sometimes nearly speechless, as Winters spun an entire sketch out of thin air. Their dynamic was special. Carson, the quiet ringmaster, and Winters, the wild creative spirit who couldn't be contained. Audiences loved Winters because he reminded them of childhood play, of a time when imagination could transform anything into something magical. His routines felt both spontaneous and timeless, proof that comedy didn't always need punchlines or polish. Sometimes, it just needed a mind daring enough to let creativity run wild. There was also a vulnerability to Winters' style. His characters often had quirks, flaws, and little shades of sadness, which made them more human. You weren't just laughing at the absurdity, you were connecting with the humanity behind it. That ability to mix silliness with depth made his performances unforgettable. On Carson's stage, Winters proved that improvisation could be just as powerful as a scripted routine, maybe even more so. Every appearance carried the thrill of unpredictability, the feeling that anything could happen, and usually did. Today, Jonathan Winters is remembered as a pioneer of improv comedy, an influence felt in generations of performers who followed. But his Tonight Show moments remain some of the purest examples of what made him great. A mind that turned ordinary moments into extraordinary laughter. With Carson as the first to applaud. Character number 9, Bob Newhart. If Jonathan Winters was chaos and imagination unleashed, Bob Newhart was the complete opposite. Calm, deliberate, and masterful in silence. His comedy didn't come from speed or volume, but from restraint. On Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, Newhart proved that you could bring down the house simply by pausing, raising an eyebrow, and letting the audience's anticipation do half the work. Newhart's signature bit was the one-sided phone call routine. He'd pick up an imaginary receiver, play just one half of a conversation, and suddenly the audience could hear the entire story unfold in their minds. The beauty was in the gaps, in the way he let silence linger just long enough to make people squirm before the punchline landed. It was minimalist comedy, but in his hands, it became art. Carson admired that discipline. He knew how hard it was to hold an audience with almost nothing but timing and facial expression. Newhart didn't rush. He let each pause breathe, each line settle, and the longer he waited, the harder the laughter hit when it finally came. Watching Carson react to those routines was a joy. He leaned forward, smiling knowingly, as if he recognized he was in the presence of a craftsman. What set Newhart apart was his ability to turn the ordinary into the absurd without raising his voice. He wasn't flamboyant or flashy. Instead, he embodied the everyman caught in ridiculous situations. His calm demeanor made the punchlines even sharper, because they arrived so quietly that they almost snuck up on you. On The Tonight Show, this contrast was powerful. Surrounded by high-energy performers like Robin Williams or Don Rickles, Newhart's slow burn felt refreshing. It was proof that comedy didn't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the softest voice in the room could command the most attention. Audiences loved him because he made them lean in. He invited them into the joke, asked them to use their imagination, and rewarded them with laughter that felt earned. That intimacy made his performances memorable in a way few others could match. Decades later, Bob Newhart remains a model of understated brilliance. His Tonight Show appearances are reminders that comedy takes many forms: wild improvisation, biting satire, or, in Newhart's case, perfect silence. And Carson, with his quiet chuckles and approving nods, recognized him as one of the finest technicians ever to grace late-night television. Character number 10, Tim Conway. If Bob Newhart made silence into an art, Tim Conway made hesitation into hilarity. He was the master of the slow burn, a comedian who could stretch a moment so thin that the audience almost begged for relief, only to collapse in laughter when the punchline finally landed. On Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, Conway's gift wasn't just in the jokes he told, but in the way he told them, slowly, deliberately, with a twinkle in his eye that hinted he was in on a secret. Conway had a rare ability to make people laugh simply by trying not to laugh himself. On stage, he often broke character, his shoulders shaking as he struggled to keep a straight face. That loss of composure was infectious. If Conway cracked, so did everyone else. His fellow guests, Carson, the studio crew, and millions watching at home. Laughter spread like wildfire. And suddenly the joke wasn't just in the punchline, but in the shared joy of watching people fail to hold it together. Carson adored him for this. Johnny valued comedians who could create laughter without forcing it, and Conway did exactly that. His bits often started so subtly that you weren't sure he was even performing. Then, slowly, the absurdity grew. By the time the audience caught on, the wave of laughter was unstoppable. Carson would often lean back in his chair, shaking his head, his face red with amusement, as Conway unraveled a routine that seemed to build forever. What made Conway unique was his patience. He trusted the comedy of the long setup, the delayed reaction, the awkward pause that blossomed into chaos. Few performers had the courage to risk silence for that long, but Conway knew that the payoff would be worth it, and every time, it was. Audiences loved him because he felt approachable. He wasn't mocking anyone or tearing anyone down. Instead, he invited you into a shared joke, a moment where the fun came from the struggle to keep it together. That warmth made his comedy timeless. Looking back, Conway's Tonight Show appearances stand as proof that laughter doesn't always need speed or sharp edges. Sometimes it comes from slowing down, savoring the moment and letting the ridiculousness of life unfold at its own pace. And with Johnny Carson smiling beside him, Tim Conway turned those moments into unforgettable late-night magic. Character number 11, Steven Wright. If Tim Conway thrived on slow burns and breaking character, Steven Wright perfected the art of not breaking at all. With his monotone voice, blank expression, and delivery so dry it bordered on surreal, Wright's comedy felt like it came from another dimension. When he first appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show in 1982, audiences didn't know what to make of him. Then the laughter began, and it didn't stop. Wright's material was unlike anything television had seen. His one-liners weren't traditional setups and punchlines. They were strange, profound observations about everyday life twisted just enough to become absurd. I spilled spot remover on my dog. Now he's gone. Lines like that sounded more like riddles than jokes, and yet they hit with perfect clarity, sending the crowd into fits of laughter. Carson recognized his brilliance immediately. After Wright's first appearance, Johnny did something almost unheard of. He invited him back the very next night. That rare gesture was Carson's ultimate endorsement, a sign that he had witnessed a unique voice in comedy and wanted America to see more. For a young comedian, it was nothing short of career-making. What made Wright special was the contrast he offered. Surrounded by high-energy performers like Robin Williams or Don Rickles, Wright stood perfectly still, barely moving, delivering each line as if it had been dropped from outer space. The stillness forced the audience to lean in, to listen closely. And when the absurdity of the joke finally clicked, the release of laughter was explosive. Carson loved comics who trusted their own style, and Wright embodied that completely. He didn't try to be anyone else. He didn't chase the crowd. He simply delivered his bizarre truth, confident that the humor would land. And it did. Millions of viewers that night saw not just a comedian, but the birth of a style that would influence an entire generation. Even decades later, Wright's Tonight Show appearances remain striking. They remind us that comedy doesn't always need volume or chaos. Sometimes it only needs a sharp mind, a strange perspective, and the courage to stand still while the world laughs around you. On Johnny Carson's stage, Steven Wright proved that quiet could be just as powerful as noise. Character number 12, Jim Carrey. Before he became one of the biggest comedy stars in Hollywood, Jim Carrey was a young, hungry impressionist looking for a break. That chance came on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, and he seized it with both hands. Carrey didn't just walk on stage, he transformed it. With his elastic face, uncanny impressions, and manic energy, he stood out immediately as something entirely new. Carrey's gift was more than mimicry. He didn't simply sound like the celebrities he imitated. He became them. His body twisted, his expressions contorted, his voice bent into uncanny replicas of Hollywood icons. Watching him perform was like watching a man dissolve into his subjects, reshaping himself in real time. Audiences were stunned, laughing not only at the accuracy of his impressions, but at the absurd exaggerations that made them even funnier. On Carson's stage, Carrey was fearless. He bounced between characters with a physicality that bordered on surreal, stretching his face into shapes most people didn't think were possible. His act was both hilarious and mesmerizing, a showcase of pure originality. Carson saw it instantly. After Carrey's first set, Johnny did what every young comic dreamed of. He invited him over to the couch. That gesture was more than a courtesy. It was Carson's stamp of approval, the signal that this performer had something special. For Carey, it was the moment that changed everything. The Tonight Show appearance launched him into national recognition. Almost overnight, he shifted from a quirky unknown to one of the most talked-about newcomers in comedy. Audiences who saw him on Carson's stage knew they were witnessing the birth of a star who could take comedy in directions no one else had imagined. Looking back, those early moments remain striking, not just because of Carey's talent, but because of what they represented. The Tonight Show had always been the crucible where legends were forged, and Carey's debut was proof the tradition was alive. He carried the same spark as the greats before him, raw, risky, and unforgettable. Decades later, Jim Carrey's career would span blockbuster films, stand-up tours, and dramatic performances. But for many, the defining image remains that first night with Johnny Carson, when a young impressionist made the king of late-night laugh out loud and stepped into history. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson wasn't just a late-night program, it was a proving ground, a place where comedy legends were made. For over 3 decades, Carson's stage became the arena where risk met opportunity, where timing collided with talent, and where a single laugh from the host could transform a career. Think of George Carlin, the fearless satirist who dissected society with biting wit. Or Richard Pryor, who bared his soul and turned personal pain into universal laughter. Robin Williams brought the storm, a whirlwind of characters that left audiences breathless, while Rodney Dangerfield mastered the rhythm of relentless one-liners that defined an entire persona. Joan Rivers broke barriers as Carson's hand-picked protégé, her sharp humor paving the way for countless women in comedy. Buddy Hackett's warmth made him feel like family, while Don Rickles brought danger to late-night television with his merciless insult comedy. Jonathan Winters reminded us that imagination alone could create worlds of laughter, and Bob Newhart proved that restraint and silence could be just as powerful as noise. Tim Conway made hesitation hilarious, dragging everyone, including Carson, into contagious laughter. Steven Wright showed that comedy could be strange, profound, and delivered with a whisper. And then came Jim Carrey, the young impressionist whose elastic face and fearless originality pointed to a future of comedy that few could have predicted. Together, these 12 comedians didn't just entertain, they defined an era. Their Tonight Show appearances weren't isolated performances. They became cultural milestones, moments replayed, remembered, and cherished for decades. And at the center of it all sat Johnny Carson, the quiet kingmaker whose smile, laugh, or simple invitation to the couch could change a life forever. The Tonight Show under Carson proved something essential. Comedy comes in many forms: fast, slow, loud, quiet, sharp, or silly. But what mattered most was authenticity. Every one of these performers, in their own way, was unapologetically themselves. That truth is why their legacies endure, long after the stage lights dimmed. So now the question passes to you. Which of these legends made Johnny Carson laugh the hardest? Was it Carlin's fearless satire, Pryor's raw honesty, Williams's whirlwind chaos, or Dangerfield's relentless punchlines? Perhaps it was Rivers's trailblazing wit, Rickles's dangerous barbs, or Carey's rubber-faced magic. The answer lies in the laughter you still hear when you watch those moments today.